Hello, good evening. Tonight I'm going to be discussing a couple of topics, including the resting membrane potential, what an action potential is, and what capacitance is, and how those all tie together. So, just to start, let's talk about what potential means. Potential actually means to have electric charge. So, when we talk about the resting membrane potential, that is the amount of electric charge that the cell membrane is separating at rest. And this RMP, or resting membrane potential, is going to vary from cell to cell. But yeah, basically it's the difference in electrical charge between the inside and the outside of the cell at rest. And there's a couple different ways that RMP can be established. The first one is through gradients. And I want to explain what that means. So I'm going to draw a little fish tank over here with some water in it. And say on one side of this semi-permeable membrane we have 3 potassiums and 3 chloride ions. And then on the other side we have is none. What's going to happen over time is if this semi-permeable membrane has a couple of leak channels that are permeable to potassium, what's going to happen is some of these potassium ions are going to start to cross over to the other side, just to balance out the osmolarity and have an equal concentration of ions on each side. The difference, though, between this and osmolarity is these particles that we have right here are charged particles. So as potassium travels to the other side of the cell, what we're going to have is a slight problem because one side of the cell is going to be more positive than the other. So the left side here will have more positive charge and the right side will have more negative charge. So on the one hand, we have two things driving potassium to cross the membrane or not cross the membrane. One is the concentration gradient, as we were just talking about, and the other is the the electrical gradient. So eventually there's going to have to be some balance. Not all of the potassiums are going to be able to cross over because the electrical gradient is going to be pushing back this way, but at the same time the concentration gradient is going to be pushing back this way. So there will not be an equal charge on both sides. Neither will there be an equal concentration on both sides, but there will eventually be an equilibrium, and that is going to be the resting membrane potential. And so the properties of a cell membrane that account for the development of this, um, let's just start with gradients. There's something called the sodium potassium ATPase pump. And on a cell membrane, what's going to happen is we're going to have a little pump here. And what it's going to do is it's going to pump 2 potassium ions in and 3 sodium ions out. And the way that it's going to do this, because the sodium concentration is so high outside of the cell, and the potassium concentration is also high inside the cell, what this pump is doing is it's pumping these ions against their gradients. So what it's going to need is some energy, and it'll just have an ATP receptor here. When it gets the ATP, it uses that one piece of energy to pump the 3 sodium ions out and the 2 potassium ions in. What that's going to do is it's going to establish and maintain a strong gradient of high to low for the sodium from outside to inside. So the sodium's wanting to get in, and the potassium is higher on the inside than the outside, so the potassium's wanting to get out. And using this gradient, and this gradient is going to help establish the resting membrane potential, and then also something called a potassium leak channel. So in the cell membrane, there's also this potassium leak channel. It's a protein channel in the membrane that's always open. So potassium can leave, and as potassium leaves, it's going to be outside, but it's also going to leave behind a negative anion as it leaves. So what this is going to do, since we're taking positive, let me just do this. Since we're taking the positive sodium out of the cell, we're putting positive potassium into the cell, but then it is leaving. What's going to happen is this is going to cause a large negative charge inside of the cell. So the inside of the cell is going to be more negative than the outside. And the characteristic of the cell membrane that allows for this to happen is something called selective permeability. Basically, there are only certain things that can get through this cell membrane. For example, oxygen or carbon dioxide can freely diffuse across, or water. But when it comes to these ions, they're not able to cross unless there is some sort of protein channel or gated channel. Um, so this, for example, this potassium leak channel allows just potassium to leave the cell. Potassium wants to leave. Obviously, not all of it can leave due to what we talked about up here because of the concentration gradient, but its electrical gradient is going to want, or because of its electrical gradient, but its concentration gradient is going to want it to leave. And this is not the only channel. There's also gated channels, and one gated channel that's important is the sodium leak channel. And what happens with the sodium leak channel? Sodium wants, not Ca, Na wants to get into the cell, but it cannot. What happens sometimes during action potentials, which we'll talk about in a second, is um, if the little, basically there is a spring holding this door shut, and on the outside of the cell there's positive charges, on the inside there's negative charges, but if the overall negativity of the cell gets positive enough, what will happen is there won't be enough charges here to hold this spring closed, and the gate will open for a sec. So sodium will rush in and cause the cell to get much more positive. And as that happens, um, immediately this little ball right here will come in and block that channel, restricting the sodium to come in, um, and that will stop that. But yeah, that is an example of a voltage gated channel. So that's another thing that helps to the cell membrane to establish resting membrane potential. There's a couple different factors that impact resting membrane potential's size. A couple of those include the ionic gradients, as we discussed, the membrane permeability, the sodium potassium ATP pump. Another thing that can affect it is if there's a sudden change in extracellular ion concentrations. For example, hyperkalemia or hypokalemia. Changes in the extracellular potassium concentrations can cause potassium to either want to leave more or want to leave less, and that can have different effects on the cell and action potentials. And one other thing is that we discussed in class is the Nernst equation. So the Nernst equation describes the membrane potential at which there is no net flow of a particular ion across the membrane. So let me you can do it for any ion. So it'll say E ion, and this is like the equilibrium potential of an ion. That's equal to negative 61.5 over Z. Z is just the valence charge, so either positive or negative, times log of the concentration inside of the cell of this particular ion over the concentration outside of the cell of this particular ion. So this is basically showing whether the ion wants to get into or out of the cell. And then using this equilibrium potential of that ion, we can calculate something called driving force. And driving force, this is the equation right here. Driving force is the difference between the membrane potential and the ion's equilibrium potential. So Vm is going to be the membrane potential, Vm right here, and then the equilibrium potential of the ion will be right here. And depending on the cell's membrane potential and the ion's equilibrium potential, that's going to determine its driving force, whether the cell wants to get into or out of the cell. So that all of that is going to affect the size of the RMP and how much magnitude it will have. Next up, let's head over to action potentials and go over those a little bit. So the basic description that I can give of an action potential is it is a rapid change in the membrane potential, which we would call depolarization, which is followed by a rapid return to the resting membrane potential, which is repolarization. So we've got depolarization and repolarization. And basically I want to take us through the events of an action potential. So I'm going to draw a little chart here, graph. Okay, so this bottom dotted line is at negative 70, um, negative 70 MV, and this is the um, charge of a cell. It's not every cell, but some cells are going to be at negative 70. And then this dotted line right here is going to be our threshold. And what's going to happen is our cells will have a resting membrane potential at this charge, but any stimulus can cause it to become more positive. Once the cell hits a certain positivity level here, we'll say it's about negative 55. What's going to happen is that depolarization that we were talking about earlier is going to rapidly happen. As it depolarizes, eventually those sodium channels are going to begin to close, the ones that we had opened earlier. And there's also going to be some voltage gated potassium channels that are going to begin to open so that we can repolarize this cell. So we'll start to see a rapid drop. Once we hit this threshold, it's going to chill out a little bit, and then usually there's going to be a little bit of hyperpolarization here where we go below negative 70, and then we'll return to our normal level. Let's just go through each step here. So here, threshold is reached, and our voltage gated sodium channels are going to be opened. As we reach the top of the action potential and the top of depolarization, the voltage gated sodium channels are going to close. And we're going to have voltage gated potassium channels open. And that's to restore the negative charge of the cell. As they do that, it's going to cause this decrease here. And once we hit threshold again, the voltage gated potassium channels will begin to close, and it'll just rely on the potassium leak channels from there. So channels to here's going to be a brief period of hyperpolarization where the cell gets more negative than it was before until those gradients are completely restored. So this first section over here we like to call rising phase. This second section is called falling phase. This is hyperpolarization, and then after hyperpolarization is right here. That's where we get back to normal. And then there's also two things. There's something called a refractory period. And basically what happens is there's two types of refractory periods. There's an absolute refractory period, and there is a relative refractory period. And basically, in this time right here, we are above threshold, and we're not going to be able to do another action potential at this point. But once we pass this threshold right here, what's going to happen is we enter something called relative refractory period, and that's until we get back to normal levels. At this point, another action potential is possible, but it would take much more stimulus and much more energy to be able to do one, just because of the normal concentration gradients and membrane charges haven't been restored yet. So the electrochemical gradients have not been restored. At this point right here, post hyperpolarization, another action potential will be possible as normal. So yes. And lastly here, I wanted to compare and contrast something called graded potential versus the action potential. So if we were to draw a graded potential here on our graph, it would look something like this. A bump that doesn't quite reach threshold, and then that comes back down. The difference between a graded potential and action potential, there's a lot of difference. Their amplitudes are different, so a graded potential can have different stimulus strengths. It can be small or large. An action potential, though, is always going to be the same size, and it's always going to be the same once the threshold is reached. That's called all or nothing. Um, the graded potential is not going to have a threshold. It occurs in response to any stimulus strength, but the action potential is only going to occur if threshold is reached at usually around 55, negative 55 MV. The channels involved, usually the um, action potential is going to involve voltage gated sodium and potassium channels. Meanwhile, the graded potential is going to be using ligand gated or mechanically ion channels. So, and then the direction of the charge or the change, the graded potential is going to be depolarizing or hyperpolarizing. It can go in either direction. Meanwhile, the action potential is always going to start with the depolarization followed by the repolarization. So it's always going to go in the same fashion. A graded potential really can go in either direction. Action potential is always going to be on a set path. Um, anyways, that's enough on the action potentials. The last thing I wanted to talk about here was something called capacitance. Capacitance. And to describe capacitance, I want to use an equation. So capacitance, bad handwriting there. Capacitance equals Q over V. And what do these variables mean? Q stands for coulombs, but in this case, it's going to be the number of charges separated by the membrane. And that is going to be over V or volts, or voltage. But the voltage, a better way to describe it would be the distance between two charges. So what do I mean by that? So let's take one cell membrane here. And let's say it's about that thick. On the inside and outside, we're going to have positive and negative charges just because of the negative inside of the cell. So we would say here that Q would be equal to 3 because of the number of charges separated as 3. And then voltage, the distance between the two charges would be whatever this distance is here. So whatever that value would be, that would be the capacitance. So let's say we increase the distance between the two charges with something, maybe by myelating the cell, so making some myelin right here. If we did this instead, what we're going to do is we're going to be increasing the distance. If we increase the distance, the capacitance will go down. Meanwhile, if we take our same membrane here and we add a couple of charges, we will increase the amount of charges, which would in turn increase the capacitance. So basically, the more charge on the inside and the outside of the cell, more capacitance. The more distance between those charges, the less capacitance, and vice versa. And this is something that's going to help us determine our length constant. So let me just write that down. Our length constant is going to have an equation here. This is length constant, and that's going to be equal to the square root of Rm over Ri. Rm is going to stand for membrane resistance. Ri is going to stand for internal resistance. So, in a neuron, what happens is a positive charge flows in. That's an action potential. So let's redraw. Let's say a positive charge flows in from a maybe a voltage gated sodium channel. When that positive charge flows in, it's going to create a Bwong effect, as Brother Shah described it. And that charge is going to kind of send out like an echo, and that's going to go through this neuron until it synapses and transfers to another neuron, and that's how they're going to communicate with each other. But there's a couple things that are going to affect the little energy waves here from this positive charge. One thing that can impact it is the membrane resistance. So if we have more membrane resistance, so say a thicker membrane, for example, a myelinated membrane right here, what that's going to do is it's going to decrease the amount of ions that can escape the membrane. When there's less ions escaping, there's a higher chance of this signal continuing strong and not escaping through this membrane. One thing that can negatively impact it, though, is internal resistance, which is Ri. So if there is a lot of negative charges in here, and maybe some negatively charged proteins, and basically anything inside the cell that could get in the way, it is going to interfere with that signal and cause it to weaken or even completely die out. So if the membrane resistance is increased, then the length constant is going to increase. If the internal resistance is increased, the length constant is going to decrease. And that is the way that myelinated cells are going to impact capacitance and the length constant of a positive charge in a neuron. And it looks like that is going to be all for tonight. Thank you so much for listening, and I will sign off.